They laughed at him. I actually want you to understand that first, because everything that comes after only makes sense if you know how it started. With laughter. With a room full of decorated officers from 6 different civilizations, all of them looking at this one unremarkable Terran and laughing. He was too short, too quiet. He, to be fair, had a dent in his helmet he'd never bothered to fix. He was eating something out of a foil packet that smelled like scorched minerals and old regret. He didn't salute when Admiral Vethran entered. He didn't even look up. The Admiral's aide filed a formal complaint. The human finished his food. I was the one assigned to observe him, to document him, to write the report that would determine whether the Terran Coalition's frontline specialist was an asset worth the diplomatic friction or a liability worth the polite rejection. I'd 40 standard cycles of intelligence work behind me. I'd assessed warlords, infiltrators, collapsed governments, and biological weapons. I was TBH, not prepared for one medium-height mammal with bad posture and a very specific kind of stillness that I kept misreading as boredom. It wasn't boredom. I know that now. What I didn't know, what none of us knew, was that 3 days before his arrival, Warlord Keth Vaughn of the Sorod Reach had transmitted a single encrypted message to an unknown receiver. Intelligence had flagged it, which nobody had decoded it yet. It contained one word, a name, his. Log entry 7204. Standard in my opinion. Timestamp 14.09. Cycle 887. I'm recording this because my supervisor, senior analyst Avrin, told me to keep a field journal for the duration of the Vaughn Reach assignment. I hate field journals. They feel like confession booths for people who made bad decisions. I'll try to be objective, which I'm already failing. The human arrived on a mid-grade transport with no escort, no formal delegation, and approximately 40 kilograms of personal gear, most of which appear to be held together with synthetic adhesive and stubbornness. His name was Brennan. First name withheld from the briefing packet. Not redacted, just absent, like whoever filed his profile ran out of enthusiasm halfway through. He was assigned to Observation Bay 4, which in diplomatic parlance means the room we use when we don't know where else to put someone. I've been stationed in Bay 4 myself, once after the peripheral incident. I didn't tell him this. I honestly told him where the water recyclers were, showed him the emergency exits, and retreated to my monitoring station before he could ask me anything. He didn't ask me anything. He sat down on the edge of the cot, the very edge like he was ready to stand again at any moment, and stared at the wall. I watched him stare at the wall for 11 minutes. I noted in my opinion, this in the log, I don't know why. The briefing the following morning was held in the Joint Operations Chamber, which seats 40 and smells permanently of Vethran's nerve-calming incense, a detail that, I assure you, I mention only because the human visibly reacted to the smell. Not negatively. He tilted his head and breathed in like it was familiar, which it shouldn't have been. Vethran's incense is made from a root that doesn't grow outside the Reach territories. I flagged this in my log with 3 question marks and then kept watching. The briefing was sort of given by Admiral Yella Vethran herself. 8 limbs, full diplomatic regalia, the particular shade of deep blue that her kind produce when they're performing confidence rather than feeling it. She outlined the situation in her measured, careful way, and I'll reproduce the relevant points here not because I enjoy transcription, but because my supervisor basically asked for context-rich field notes, and I'm nothing if not thorough when threatened. Keth Vaughn, sort of plus Warlord. Current territorial like commander of the Sorod Reach, a stretch of contested space that had changed hands 11 times in 40 cycles, and currently sat on the last viable approach corridor to 3 inhabited systems. Vaughn had been a problem for a long time. Not a loud problem, and quiet ones are worse. Pretty much, he didn't make demands. He didn't broadcast grievances. He positioned fleets, and he waited. He had a particular gift for discovering supply chain vulnerabilities weeks before the people running the supply chains knew they existed, which suggested either an intelligence network of terrifying depth or a mind that ran on a fundamentally different calculus than everyone else at the table. The goal of this summit was to negotiate a Reach access agreement, one that would allow coalition vessels to transit Vaughn's territory without incident in exchange for material support, and a formal cessation of the 6-system trade blockade that was slowly strangling his outer settlements. Simple, in theory. In practice, Vaughn had rejected 4 previous delegations. 2 of those rejections had involved the delegation ships being returned, stripped, engine cold, and crewless to the nearest coalition outpost. The crews were recovered eventually, alive, unharmed, but Vaughn had, in my opinion, kept their shoes and all of them. Every single pair of footwear from every crew member from both ships. Basically, nobody knew why. It was in sort of the briefing. I read it twice. I still don't know why. Vethran finished her overview and opened the floor for questions. 3 senior officers spoke. A Drovani trade representative made a comment about historical grievances that was technically relevant and diplomatically disastrous. A junior aide from the 6th Fleet dropped something and apologized for 4 minutes. In my opinion, Brennan hadn't moved. He was sitting in the 2nd row, slightly off-center, with his arms resting on his knees, and his eyes tracking Vethran with an attention that seemed idle, but wasn't. I've spent enough time watching people watch things to know the difference between passive observation and something working very hard to look passive. Vethran asked if there were additional questions, which Brennan raised one hand. The shoes, he said, and the ones from the other delegations. Do they all have a standard military tread pattern? The room went quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when someone says something that doesn't fit the expected register of the conversation. Not offensive, not wrong, just displaced. Like a sound arriving from the wrong direction. Vethran's middle limbs shifted, and she's 4 of them, and when she's processing something unexpected, the 2nd and 3rd ones make a subtle adjustment in tension that her species probably doesn't notice, but that I've been watching for 3 years. That information, she, to be fair, said, was not included in the standard briefing. I know, Brennan said. That's why I'm asking. I'll be honest. My initial profile on Brennan was dismissive. I'm recording that here because I believe in the integrity of the log. Because if I'm, for what it's worth, going to be wrong about something, I'd rather it be documented than convenient. My initial assessment: mid-career coalition operative, likely intelligence adjacent given the ambiguity of his file, selected for this assignment due to either genuine specialized skill or bureaucratic accident. I weighted the latter at roughly 60% probability. The shoe question moved it to 40, and not because it was clever. It was probably clever. But what moved the needle was what happened after, which was nothing. He honestly asked the question. Vethran said she'd look into it, and Brennan nodded and went back to looking like a man thinking about lunch. He wasn't. I was watching. His eyes didn't defocus. Plus, I know what genuine inattention looks like. Every species does it differently, but the physiological signatures have common threads. Reduced saccadic activity, mild tension release in the facial muscles, a slight drop in postural engagement. Brennan's eyes stayed sharp. His posture stayed exactly where it was, that particular almost ready angle that I've been cataloging since his arrival. He was listening to everything. He was listening to everything and performing boredom with a precision that required practice. I noted this. I added a 4th question mark. The first sort of real incident happened on day 2. Not an incident. Technically, nothing flagged, nothing that made any official report. I'm including it because I'm the one who saw it, and my supervisor said context-rich, and context sometimes lives in the things that don't get filed. Brennan had been given a limited access pass to the station's mid-ring, which covers logistics, transit management, and the commissary. Standard observer clearance. He could see process, but not personnel records, move through common areas, but not tactical corridors. I was monitoring his movements, as assigned, through the station's interior sensor grid. He spent 3 hours in the commissary. Not eating. He sat with a cup of something and a data tablet, and didn't look at either of them for most of that time. He was watching the commissary staff. Again, I know what it looks like when someone is watching something. The commissary on this station services 4 different coalition member species, which means 4 different dietary preparation zones, for different utensil protocols, for different waste handling systems. It runs on a rotation schedule that nobody outside logistics has any reason to care about. Brennan was tracking the rotation schedule. Plus, I realized this on the 2nd hour, when I noticed his attention consistently returning to the same 2 staff members at the same intervals. On the 3rd hour, one of those staff members, a young Hethrani female, 2nd-year service name, flagged in my notes as set, took a slightly longer route between stations than her usual path. Brennan watched her the entire way. Didn't react. didn't note anything on his tablet, and Set was pulling double duty. I checked later. She covered a, I guess, gap in the third prep zone because someone called out sick. The longer route TBH was because the standard path between second and third zone had a floor panel repair in progress. There was no breach. There was nothing wrong. There was nothing there, which except that Brennan had enticed it before it was nothing, which means he was mapping variance, not routine. I didn't report this observation. I'm not sure why. I'm noting that I'm not sure why. Day 3 and log entry 7,211. This is the day the laughter happened. I mentioned it in the hook, and I'm returning to it now because it deserves the full record. There was a reception, which pre-negotiation, formal, the kind of event that exists to let delegations take each other's measure before anyone has to commit to a position. To be fair, Admiral Vethran presided. Warlord Vaughn had sent a representative, not himself, which was expected and calculated, a standard dominant signal, in the form of his chief diplomatic officer, a Varric male named Osendrav, who wore 2 formal rank bars that I believe were decorative, and moved through the room with the specific confidence of someone who has been told they're intimidating and has chosen to believe it. Drav was tall. By most, I guess, species standards, he was tall by anyone's standards, 2.3 standard heights, long-limbed, with a particular bone density and dermis patterning of high-gravity Varric origin. He entered kind of the room, and the room adjusted the way rooms do when something large and purposeful arrives. He found Brennan within 40 seconds. I don't know if that was deliberate or instinctive. I watched honestly his eyes cross the room and land on the human and stop. Maybe he'd been briefed. Maybe Vaughn had pretty much told him specifically to find the Terran. Maybe he just noticed the one person in the room who wasn't performing anything. He walked over. He looked down. Brennan looked up. Drav said something in trade standard that my translation matrix rendered as, "You are the specialist they've sent." The inflection. And I want to be precise here, because inflection matters in Varric, carried a sub-register that implies the speaker has just seen something smaller than expected and is deciding whether to be amused or contemptuous. Brennan said, "Yeah, just that." Single syllable, sort of flat, without any particular investment in the word. Drav smiled. Plus, Varric smiles are wide and display a lot of tooth. It's not aggression, or not only aggression, but it reads as one if you're not calibrated. He said something to the Varric adjutant behind him, and the adjutant laughed. Then 2 nearby Drovani trade reps laughed, because Drovani laugh when Varric laugh as a social mirroring instinct they mostly can't help. Then, one of the 6th Fleet junior staff laughed because they thought they'd missed a joke. The room had a laugh at the small Terran who'd said, "Yeah." Brennan let it run. He didn't tighten. He didn't move. Plus, he stood there with his cup of whatever it was and waited for the laugh to finish like he was waiting for rain. Then he said to Drav, very quietly, the Warlord, "Has he been sleeping?" The laugh stopped. Drav's smile, for what it's worth, didn't disappear. It changed. Plus, hardened at the edges. The Varric have a phrase. I looked it up later, for the feeling of stepping on ground you thought was solid and feeling it shift. I don't think they expected to need it at a diplomatic reception. That, Drav said, isn't a question for this forum. No, Brennan agreed. It's not. He went back to his drink. I stood at my observation post and watched Drav watch Brennan for the next 23 minutes. The Varric diplomat didn't approach him again. He also didn't stop watching him. I filed this under significant. I didn't know what it signified. Plus, I still don't quite. But the question wasn't random. Nothing Brennan did was random, I was beginning to understand. And the reaction it produced in Drav told me that the question had landed somewhere specific and real. The Warlord. Has he been sleeping? Not. Does he have weaknesses? Not. What basically are his supply routes? Not. What does he want from this negotiation? His sleep. I spent that night going back through everything we had on Vaughn. I want to say I had a theory. I didn't have a theory. I had a discomfort that was shaping itself into something, the way a pressure system shapes into weather. I've learned over 40 cycles to respect that particular kind of discomfort. Keth Vaughn, Warlord of the Sorrowed Reach. Age, estimated mid-career by his species standard. Biology, Varric, same as Drav, same gravity-heavy build and structural density, though the records suggested Vaughn had. Lighter dermis patterning than average, an aesthetic anomaly, or a genetic marker, depending on who you asked. Military history, extensive and not entirely linear. He'd started as a signals officer, not combat. Signals. He'd spent 8 cycles in the Reach Comms division before the first political reorganization pushed him sideways into a logistics coordination role, and then another reorganization had somehow produced a man who was now the territorial authority of 11 contested systems. The records on how he'd gotten from signals officer to warlord were incomplete in the way that suggested they'd been made incomplete on purpose. I found another thing. A medical note buried in a secondary dossier, the kind of file that gets attached to a primary profile and then ignored because nobody thinks to click through. Vaughn suffered from, a documented sleep disorder. Irregular cycles, fragmented rest, a recurring physiological pattern that his species called thought. Roughly translated, the body that forgets to stop working. It had been flagged as a potential operational liability twice in his career and dismissed twice by his superiors. You don't dismiss the person who keeps winning. Brennan had asked if the warlord was sleeping. I stared at that medical note for a long time. He knew, or he suspected, or he'd read something somewhere in the intelligence available to his coalition brief that I'd read too and not flagged because hadn't he known what I was looking for. He knew what he was looking for. Day 4, 0600 station time. I went to Brennan's observation bay. I want to note, for the record, that this was not standard procedure. My role was observation and documentation, not engagement. But Davrin was 12 systems away. He slept well, and I had questions that weren't going to answer themselves by watching sensor feeds. Brennan was awake, sitting on the edge of his cot. The edge, always the edge, with a data tablet face down on a mattress beside him and a cup of something steaming that smelled genuinely unpleasant. You drink that voluntarily? I said. I meant the cup. It was my opening. I'm not proud of it. Yeah, he said. I stood in the doorway for a moment. The sleep question. Last night, he looked at me. He had the kind of eyes that don't change expression much on their own. The expression comes from somewhere else in the face, around the mouth, and the set of the jaw, and his mouth and jaw were doing something that I can only describe as patient. I read his file, I said. The medical annex. He said nothing. You think his sleep disorder affects his negotiating posture? He turned his cup in his hands. Once. Twice. I think, he said, that a man who hasn't slept in 3 days makes decisions that look like aggression and aren't. I stood there. The recycler hummed, which somewhere deeper in the station, the shift change alarm was cycling. The previous delegations, I said, came when he was tired. Brennan shrugged one shoulder. Probably. Plus, I don't know for certain. But the shoe thing, I waited. That's not dominance behavior. That's compulsion. You strip someone's shoes, you're not making a statement. You're collecting, I guess, something. You're keeping something close. He looked at his cup. Man who keeps things close takes things that feel like security. Man, in my opinion, who can't sleep, maybe. Man whose body won't stop working. Another pause. Or I'm completely wrong, and he's just weird about shoes. He drank. The smell was terrible. I actually stood in his doorway for another moment, and then said the summit begins in 6 days. Yeah, he said. I know. I left. I went back to my station, and I wrote, Subject Brennan, maybe the most dangerous person on this installation. Recommend expanding observation parameters. Then I stared at it for a while. Then I deleted most dangerous and wrote most consequential. That felt closer to true. That in my opinion, evening, a second encrypted transmission was intercepted from Vaughn's personal relay. Same receiver. Same encryption signature. This time, 3 words, which is he ready? We didn't know what that meant. We didn't know who the receiver was. We didn't kind of know what ready referred to, or what Vaughn expected, or why the warlord of the Sorrowed Reach, a man who had stripped 4 diplomatic crews of their shoes and sent them home, was apparently waiting on a human we'd been treating as a footnote. I documented the transmission. I added a 5th question mark. I didn't sleep well that night, either. The preparation period before a summit of this scale involves what my people call Drevin, the formal exchange of procedural frameworks. Basically, 2 sides agreeing on how they will agree before they agree on anything. It is important, necessary, and almost entirely theatrical, and it requires a great deal of standing in rooms while senior officials speak carefully at each other. I was assigned to monitor the Terran delegation's representation in these pre-sessions. The Terran delegation being, in total, Brennan, a junior communications attaché named Owusu who laughed too loud at things that weren't that funny. Seemed to be aware of this, but unable to stop, and a senior trade legal advisor named Ferreira, who I have since concluded is either brilliant or asleep with her eyes open. I genuinely cannot tell. Brennan attended, exactly 2 of the 5 pre-session briefings. He attended the one on spatial access rights frameworks. He attended the one on historical grievance documentation. He skipped the ones on trade mechanism structures, diplomatic immunity protocols, and mutual defense clause language, which in terms of standard summit preparation is roughly equivalent to a surgeon attending the hand-washing training, but skipping the surgery part. I flagged this as an observation, which I didn't yet flag it as concern. The 2 sessions he attended, I watched him. He sat slightly behind the main coalition table, in the chair reserved for technical advisors, with no tablet and no physical notes. He listened. Occasionally he'd make a small gesture. Not a gesture exactly. More like his hands would shift once, very slightly, as if adjusting a grip on something. I cataloged it. I couldn't contextualize it. The session on, to be fair, spatial access rights frameworks went 40 minutes longer than scheduled because Drav, still representing Vaughn's position remotely, raised 17 technical objections to the proposed corridor geometry. Now, I mean, all of them were valid. 4 of them were specifically drawn from an obscure subclause in the original Reach Incorporation Charter that most people at the table had clearly never read. The Terran trade legal advisor, Ferreira, handled most of them. She had clearly read the charter. Drav didn't seem pleased. Brennan said nothing during this session. Not one word, and he sat in his technical advisor's chair and watched Drav's holographic representation argue with Ferreira about corridor geometry, and I'd have assumed he was disengaged, except that when Drav raised the 14th objection, Brennan's hands shifted again, and this time I caught it, clearly enough to recognize it. He was counting, not the objections, the concessions, and each time Ferreira gave ground on a technical point, slightly, professionally, in the way you do when you're playing a longer game, his left hand would make the smallest tally mark motion against his thigh. Drav raised 17 objections. Ferreira conceded on 6 of them. Brennan's honestly, count, as near as I could track it, 6. After the session, in the corridor outside the briefing chamber, I fell in a step beside him. You were counting, in my opinion, the concessions, I said. He didn't look at me. He had a very particular way of not looking at people while clearly still tracking them. Peripheral attention, constant like something that had been told early and often that it needed to keep its sight lines clear. We gave on the wrong 6, he said. Ferreira has 40 years of trade negotiation experience. Sure. He took the corridor junction that led toward the mid-ring commissary. I followed. But Drav isn't negotiating for trade. He's negotiating for position. The 6 concessions Ferreira made, they all reduce our operational flexibility in the outer transit lanes. She probably sees them as minor. They're not minor if the goal is to make sure we can't move a fleet resupply through the Reach without Vaughn's direct authorization. I walked beside him and didn't say anything. It's fine, Brennan said. We'll need those lanes anyway. It basically just means Vaughn knows exactly what we need them for. He said it like this was acceptable. Like knowing the opponent understood your vulnerabilities was not a crisis, but a condition. Like the game was already in a phase that had passed the point of concealment. So Vaughn knows what we need, I said, and we know what he needs. Yeah. And the corridor geometry discussion is prologue, he said. We reached the commissary, and he poured himself something terrible. I stood across from him at the service counter and watched him drink it. You've done this, before, I said, which met Vaughn. He didn't answer for a moment, which was itself an answer, or the outline of one. Not met, he said. Not directly. If that makes sense. I pulled Brennan's full operational record that afternoon. Full access. I had the clearance. I'd just been using a lighter hand before out of professional habit. My supervisor hates it when I go to full access early because it means I've started to care about a subject, and caring about subjects makes analysis worse. My supervisor isn't wrong. The record was heavily redacted. Not suspiciously, I guess, just standard classification layers, the kind that accumulate on an active operative's file the way sediment accumulates on anything that stays in the water long enough. I read what was visible. I noted what wasn't. I built a shape out of the negative space. What sort of I found an outline. Brennan had worked 2 previous assignments in or adjacent to the Sorod Reach. The first, 8 cycles ago, was listed as Communications Infrastructure Assessment, which is intelligence speak for something that required a person to be physically inside Vaughn's territory without officially being there. Duration, 41 days. Outcome, classified. The second assignment, for cycles ago, Diplomatic Observer Support, Reach Border Dispute Mediation. Standard sounding. But the border dispute it referenced, the one between Vaughn's outer settlements and the Keth Cooperative, had ended with a negotiated settlement that nobody had predicted that required both parties to give up something they'd each publicly declared non-negotiable and that had held for 4 cycles without incident. The settlement documents were public record. I pulled them. They were 1,200 pages. Page 407, buried in an appendix on communications protocol for the Joint Monitoring Commission. A single sentence acknowledging the work of coalition facilitation support personnel. No names, but the facilitation support role had been filled, per the logistical annex of the same document, by a single coalition operative working alone without formal diplomatic credentials. I looked at the timing. I looked at the clearance level. I looked honestly at the 41 days from the first assignment and the 4 cycles of held, peace from the second. Then I went back to the commissary. Brennan had left, but I found him on the observation deck on the station's upper ring, the one with the wide viewport that faces the Reach approach corridor, and I said, "You brokered the Keth settlement." He was looking out at the stars. "The Reach looks like nothing from this distance. Just dark and far." "No," he said. "I helped 2 very tired people find a way to stop fighting without losing face." He paused. "That's different from brokering." Vaughn was one of the 2 tired people. He didn't deny it. "That's why he sent that message," I said. "When he found out you were coming to this summit. He already knows you." Brennan was quiet for a moment. The viewport, I think, was thick enough that you couldn't hear anything from outside. No vibration, no void. Just the light of distant stars coming through at a slight angle. The Reach's direction casting the observation deck in that thin, bluish illumination you get when a near significant star is behind something large. "He knows what I'm trying to do," Brennan said. "That's not the same as knowing me." "What are you trying to do?" He turned from the viewport. The light from the Reach direction caught the side of his face, and I noticed for the first time the scar that ran from his left jawline up toward his ear, old, settled into the skin, the kind that's been there long enough to become just part of the face. I wondered when it happened, and I wondered if I'd find it in the redacted sections. "The Warlord of the Sorod Reach," he said, "controls the last viable approach to 3 inhabited systems. He's been offered 4 deals, all of which would have given him material support, and ended the blockade of his outer settlements, which are slowly dying." He said this flat, informational, without the weight that slowly dying should probably carry. He turned all 4 down. Plus, every analyst in the coalition has a theory about why. Most of them are about power consolidation. Territory, fear of losing to take advantage of the corridor gives him. Those are reasonable theories. "They're wrong," Brennan said, "or they're not complete." He looked back at the viewport. He turned them down because every single delegation that came to him came with something to offer and nothing to lose. They were emissaries. They had a mandate and a safety net and 6 flagships behind them. They were playing a game. I waited. "Vaughn isn't playing a game," Brennan said. "He's protecting something. You protect something differently than you play a game. You can be reasoned out of a game. You can't be reasoned out of protection. You can only be shown that the thing is safe." The recycled air in the observation deck was slightly stale. I noticed the mineral tang that comes from recyclers on their 4th filter cycle. I focused on it for a moment, which was probably displacement, which I probably wasn't going to write in my log. "What is he protecting?" I asked. "Plus, Brennan est jeu shifted." That expression adjacent, thing his face did instead of an actual expression. "His people," he said. "But not just his people. Something happened in the Reach 8 cycles ago, before the political reorganization. Something that made a signals officer decide he needed to become a warlord." He paused, and something like that made him take everyone's shoes. I thought about the medical note. The VFAL, the body that forgets to stop working. "He's pretty much afraid," I said, and it came out smaller than I intended. "Yeah," Brennan said. "Has been for a long time." He moved toward the exit. "Afraid people don't respond to offers, and they respond to someone who already knows what they're afraid of, and didn't use it. He left the observation deck. I stood at the viewport for a while. Outside, actually, the reach direction was just dark and stars. Day 6. Log entry 7224. The interception team decoded the second message. Look, is he ready? The receiver. Once actually, they traced the relay chain, a private communications node registered to a medical service contractor operating in the Reach's second-tier settlements. Not military, not intelligence. Medical. The contractors, in my opinion, primary service records showed standard settlement health support work. But their client list, partially visible through public licensing records, included a cluster of small communities in the outer reach that had been flagged in our economic distress modeling 2 cycles back. High mortality, collapsed infrastructure, the slow, quiet kind of dying that happens when supply lines fail over years instead of hours. Someone in those settlements was the receiver. That, to be fair, medical contractor was the intermediary, and Vaughn's message, "Is he ready?" wasn't about the summit. It was about whether Brennan had already been briefed on what was actually happening in those settlements. I actually took this to Brennan directly. I'm sort of not apologizing for the breach of protocol. The summit was in 48 hours, and I had a decoded message that reframed the entire premise of the negotiation. He read the intercept. He read it once, folded it, handed it back. "Yeah," he said. "He knows I know. You knew about the settlements. I knew they were getting worse. I didn't have the numbers until now." He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Not unfocused. That sharp, still attention aimed upward at nothing in particular. "The blockade is killing people. Not the blockade from our side, the one he's running. He's pulling resource allocations from the outer settlements to reinforce the inner systems because he doesn't have enough for both. He can't end the blockade without the coalition support, and he can't accept the coalition support without guarantees he hasn't gotten yet." Guarantees for what? He looked at me. "That we won't do what everyone else did," he said. I didn't ask what everyone else did, and I knew what everyone else did. The Reach was contested space. It had changed hands 11 times. What everyone else did when they had access and leverage and the moment was right was take. What everyone else did when the thing in the corridor became more valuable than the people in the corridor was use it. "He thinks the coalition will absorb the Reach," I said, formally. Under treaty language, that looks like partnership. Or informally, under operational language that looks like access agreements. Brennan picked up his cup, the terrible cup. It was always the terrible cup, and drank. He's been a signals officer. He knows how communication shapes reality. He knows exactly how an access agreement becomes a permanent administrative presence, becomes a reclassification. The recycler hummed. Down the corridor, Owusu laughed at something. That too loud laugh, slightly out of register. "So kind of what do you do?" I said, with 48 hours before the summit, and a warlord who's afraid of exactly the thing you're there to offer him. Brennan set down the cup. "I go in without the offer," he said. I stared at him. "Without the TBH, that's the entire negotiating mandate. That's what this summit, I know what the summit's for." He stood. "I'm not saying we don't make a deal. I'm saying I don't walk in there with a prepared offer and a coalition flag and a list of concessions because that's the same thing everyone else did." He'll lock up the moment he sees the framework. He rolled one shoulder back, a small movement, something working itself loose. I walk in as a person who already knows what's wrong, and I let him tell me. And that's different. I stood in the corridor outside his bay and watched him go back inside. I stood there for a while after the door closed. Then I went to my station and sent a priority message to Davrin, 12 systems away. It said, "I believe the Terran specialist has a strategy that doesn't match the coalition's approved negotiating framework. I also believe it might be the only one that works. Awaiting guidance." Davrin responded in 14 minutes. The response said, "Document everything. Do not interfere. If this, in my opinion, goes badly, I was never briefed." I looked at that message for a long time. Then I basically opened my log and wrote entry 7224, and I recorded all of this because if it goes badly, someone should know what actually happened. And if it doesn't, if somehow this works, someone should know that too. The summit begins tomorrow. The Warlord of the Sorrowed Reach will attend in person. He confirmed this 6 hours ago, which is the first time in 4 delegations he's agreed to physical presence at a negotiation. His reason, per Drav's formal notification, The Warlord had reason to believe this summit would be different from previous attempts. I don't know who told him that. I think I do. I went back to the observation deck that night. I don't know why. Habit, maybe something in me that wanted the wide viewport and the thinned blue light from the reach direction and the honest quiet of space that doesn't care what happens in the rooms behind it. Brennan was there, and he was sitting on the floor. Not the bench, the floor, back against the viewport housing, knees up, staring at nothing particular. His cup wasn't with him. His tablet wasn't with him. He was just sitting in the blue cast, dark, alone, doing nothing that had any operational value whatsoever. I almost left, which I didn't. I sat down on the other side of the viewport housing, not adjacent, just near. And we sat in the observation deck together without speaking for a long time, and I watched the stars in the reach direction, and I thought about a signals officer who became a warlord. Because he had to, and about what it costs a person to protect something for years while being afraid that protection will eventually destroy the thing it's meant to save. And then I thought about a human sitting with terrible coffee in a room full of people laughing at him and waiting very patiently for the laugh to end. He wasn't waiting for them to stop laughing. I understood that now, sitting in the blue light. He was waiting for the room to show him what it was. Log entry 7231. Summit day. 0430 station time. I couldn't sleep. This isn't unusual for me. I have what the station physician calls an irregular relationship with rest cycles and what I call a career in intelligence, but last night was specific. I lay on my cot in the analyst's quarters and listened to the recycler and went over the same details in a loop that wasn't productive and knew it wasn't productive and kept going anyway. The Warlord was on the station. He'd arrived at 0200 on a mid-class transit vessel with minimal escort for personal guards, Drav, and a medical aide whose presence I noted and didn't know what to do with. Vaughn himself had walked off the transit ramp and through the docking corridor without pause, without ceremony, without any of the formal territorial posturing that the protocols called for and that every previous Varec delegate had performed with visible investment. He was smaller than I expected. The records had given me his height, average for a Varec male, which still meant taller than most of the species present. Height in data is different from height in a corridor, and what the data hadn't told me was how he carried himself. Not like Drav, who wore his physicality as announcement. Vaughn moved like someone who'd spent a long time making himself easy to underestimate. I recognized it, which the same way I'd recognize something in Brennan. I watched the docking arrival feed 3 times at 0430, and then I got up and made myself something to drink that I didn't describe as terrible and tried to think clearly about what the day was going to hold. The summit was scheduled to begin at 0900. Standard format, sort of opening statements, formal agenda confirmation, initial position presentations. The coalition's lead negotiator was Admiral Vethran. Ferreira would handle TBH, the technical trade architecture. The political framework had been prepared by a team of 8 coalition advisors over the preceding month. Brennan's role, per the official schedule, technical advisory observer. Non-speaking. Per my understanding of what was actually happening, I genuinely didn't know. At 0615, I went to find him. He wasn't in his bay. He wasn't in the commissary. I found him after 11 minutes of tracking his access badge signal through the station grid, in a maintenance corridor on the station's lower ring, sitting on a conduit housing with his back against a coolant pipe that was warm to the touch. I checked later because it seemed like the kind of thing worth knowing, and his data tablet propped on his knee. He wasn't looking at the tablet. He was looking at the floor. There was nothing on the floor. Honestly, grating. A drainage channel. The faint iridescent stain of old coolant, long dried. He was looking at it with the same quality of attention he gave everything. Not vacant, not meditative, just present. Here in this maintenance corridor at 0615, with the summit in less than 3 hours, and the future of 3 inhabited systems in the balance, and the most careful and frightened warlord in contested space waiting somewhere on the station. You could have had a nicer waiting spot, I said. Nicer ones have people in them, he said. I stood in the corridor, and the coolant pipe hummed. It was to be fair, warm, that end of the lower ring. The recycling systems ran hotter down here, and the air had a different quality, heavier and slightly chemical. Not unpleasant. Well, industrial. He's here, I said, which Vaughn arrived at 0200. I know, He brought a medical aid. Brennan looked up from the floor. Not sharp, just shifted like a dial moving one notch. For himself? I said. Or, for the record, Brennan said. Documentation of his physical condition at the time of signing. If there's a signing. He picked up the tablet, set it down again, which he's been through enough negotiations where people later claimed he wasn't in his right judgment. A medical witness is how you prove otherwise. He'd thought about that. He'd thought about all of it, and you're not worried, I said. Not accusing. Look, just observing. He tilted his head slightly, which I'm worried about the right things. Which are, whether he'll trust me enough to say the actual problem out loud. In a room full of people with agendas. He looked at his hands. Everything else is logistics. I sat down on the conduit housing across from him, which was not a dignified position for senior analyst, but seemed like the right move. If he doesn't, I said. If he locks up. If Drav runs interference, and Vethran falls back to the prepared framework, and the whole thing becomes a formal technical session about corridor geometry, then it fails, Brennan said. Same as the others. And 3 inhabited systems get slower access. And the outer settlements keep, yeah. He said it without flinching. Just straight, yeah, and here's the consequence. Here is what's at stake. Not performing grimness about it. Not performing resolve. Just acknowledging it the way you acknowledge weather. That was one, kind of the things I kept finding difficult to file properly. The way he held the weight of consequences. Not lightly, I don't think he held anything lightly, but level. Without theater. Like the weight was part of the job, and he'd done the job long enough that he and the weight had reached some kind of arrangement. What do you need me to do? I said. He looked at me. I'm monitoring the session, I said. Look, standard analyst observation. I have direct communication access to Vethran's aid if the Admiral needs a private note. I paused. I'm just saying, if there's something, useful I can do from where I'm. He was quiet for a moment. If Drav tries to invoke the historical grievance clause in session, and he will, he's been building to it since the pre-sessions, Ferreira will want to counter with the partition amendments documentation. Don't let her do it in the room. I blinked. The partition amendments are our strongest counter. They're technically correct and politically disastrous, Brennan said. The partition was 30 cycles ago. Invoking it sort of in front of On tells him the coalition still thinks of the Reach as contested territory with contested history rather than a sovereign entity. We're asking for partnership. Ferreira knows the documents. Plus, she doesn't know what Vaughn hears when he hears them. I stared at him. And you do. I know what a man who became a warlord to protect his people hears when someone cites the legal documents that divided those people up 30 cycles ago. The coolant pipe hummed. I was aware of my own breathing, and I'll get a note to Ferreira before session, I said. No partition documents. He nodded. Once. We sat in the maintenance corridor for another few minutes. Not talking. The station's lower ring had a particular sound signature. More mechanical, more honest than the upper decks. The recyclers. The conduit systems. The constant low hum of something keeping people alive. The shoe thing, I said. You figured it out. Maybe. Tell me. He looked at the grating. Varek have a protection right. Plus, when a warrior takes someone under formal protection, family, ally, whatever, they take their footwear. Keep it. It means, I'll carry your path when you can't. You don't take shoes as a punishment or a dominance display. You take them because you're saying, these people are mine to protect. I sat with that for a moment. He was protecting them, I said. The diplomatic crews he sent back. He wasn't threatening them. He was claiming responsibility for their safe return. Brennan's jaw shifted. Every crew made it home. I mean, unharmed. He sent them back deliberately, safely, through systems where he could have held them indefinitely. He paused. He kept their shoes because he needed something to hold on to. Something that said he'd done the right thing by someone, even the people who came to him with bad faith offers. The maintenance corridor was very quiet. Nobody decoded that I said. Nobody asked the right question, he said. Or they asked it as a curiosity and moved on. He stood up, tucked the tablet under his arm, rolled the same shoulder back, that small working something loose movement I'd cataloged on day 2. 0900, he said. 0900, I agreed. I'll not pretend that the walk to the summit chamber was dramatic. It wasn't. It was actually walk through station corridors that smelled of recycled air and institutional cleaning compounds, populated by junior staff carrying things and looking important about it. But I'll admit I timestamps it. 0847, leaving the lower ring. 0851, junction with the main diplomatic corridor. 0857, visual on, kind of, the summit chamber entrance. I timestamp things when I don't know what else to do with my hands. The chamber was the largest formal space on the station. Oval, designed for multi-species comfort, with tiered seating that adjusted for physiological requirements, and lighting that could be modulated by species present. Today it was set for what they call neutral spectrum, which is a calibrated blend that no species finds ideal and every species finds tolerable. It always makes me feel slightly unreal. I mentioned this once to a colleague, and he said that was probably the point, which I found darkly amusing. Coalition table, Vethran, Ferreira, 2 support aides, and Brennan in the technical observer chair at the far end, slightly behind. Exactly where the schedule put him. Non-speaking. Vaughn's side, Vaughn, Drav, the medical aide, 2 guards who stood at the chamber perimeter, and a communications officer whose job I understood, and whose expression I didn't envy. I found my observation post. A raised monitoring alcove along the chamber's left wall, standard analyst position, with direct sight lines to both tables, and a private channel to Vethran's aide clipped to my collar. I sent a note about Ferreira and the partition documents before the session formally opened. 30 seconds to spare. Ferreira's head moved slightly. She found the note on her secondary display, read it, looked up. Her eyes found mine in the monitoring alcove. She gave me a very slight, very controlled look that communicated, "I'll follow this guidance under protest." I mouthed, "Please," and she turned back to the table. I'll compress the opening session because it's largely what summit openings always are, which is to say, carefully structured, technically correct, and emotionally inert. Vethran opened with the coalition's formal statement of intent. Measured, professional, exactly right. Drav responded for Vaughn's delegation with an opening that was equally measured, equally professional. Carried in its substructure a very specific and careful hostility that I suspect only Brennan and I were reading correctly. Vaughn himself said nothing for the first 40 minutes. He sat at the head of his delegation's table and listened with a stillness that I recognized, by this point, as the same quality of attention Brennan used. The kind that looks like nothing and is everything. The agenda confirmation hit its first friction at Item 4, Transit Access Preliminary Parameters, which was where Drav raised the historical grievance clause, exactly as Brennan had predicted. Drav was smooth about it, framing it as a procedural note, a request to formally acknowledge prior territorial claims before addressing present access frameworks. Vethran's aide looked to her for guidance, which Ferreira had the partition amendments documentation open on her secondary display. I watched her not touch it. What she said instead: "The coalition acknowledges the full sovereign history of the Reach territories as established by continuous habitation and self-governance, and notes that this acknowledgement supersedes and replaces all prior designation frameworks." It wasn't in the prepared brief. She'd written it in the 40 seconds between my note and the session opening. Drav paused, recalibrated, and Vaughn's eyes moved to Ferreira for the first time since the session opened. Then they moved down the coalition table, past the aides, past Vethran's formal posture, which to the far end, where Brennan sat in the technical observer chair. Brennan was looking at the table surface in front of him, not at Vaughn. Vaughn looked at him for a long time. I had my log open, which I wrote 07 minutes into formal session. Vaughn has made eye contact with Brennan. Brennan hasn't returned it. Then I wrote, "This seems intentional." The session broke for a scheduled recess at 10:40. Standard practice, multi-species endurance, physiological comfort. The chamber emptied, look, in that organized shuffle that formal events produce. I was documenting the last exchange when I looked up and found the chamber nearly empty. At the coalition table, Ferreira, head down in her notes. At Vaughn's table, Vaughn, alone, which his delegation had filed out, and he'd stayed. He, was looking at Brennan. Brennan was the last one at the coalition table. He was writing something on his tablet. Actual writing, I could see the stylus moving, and he hadn't looked up. The chamber was very quiet. Vaughn said something. Low, in Varec, not trade standard. His own language, the one that comes from the Reach's inner systems and sounds to my auditory processing like stones moving in deep water. My translation matrix took a moment, and then it gave me, "You could have used what you knew." Brennan's stylus stopped. He looked up, which they regarded each other across the empty chamber. The Warlord of the Sorrowed Reach, and the technical advisory observer in the chair at the end of the table, and I sat in my monitoring alcove and didn't breathe. Brennan said, "In trade standard, I know." Vaughn's expression didn't change. He had a particular stillness in his face. Not Drav's performed composure, something older and more tired. "For cycles," he said, still in Varric. "You've had the settlement file, the Keth documentation, everything that could be used." "Yeah," Brennan said. "Why didn't you?" Brennan set down the stylus. He looked at Vaughn the way he looked at things he was taking a precise account of. "Because it wasn't like mine to use," he said. Vaughn was quiet. "You were protecting your people," Brennan said. "That's not leverage. That's not intelligence value, which that's just..." He paused, and in the pause I heard him selecting something carefully. "That's just a person doing the only thing they know how to do." He picked up the stylus again. "I don't use that." The recycler in the chamber's upper register cycled. The lighting held its neutral spectrum, that slightly unreal quality. Ferreira's stylus scratched softly against her notes across the room. Vaughn looked at the table in front of him. Then he said, in trade standard, for the first time in the session, "My outer settlements have 16 months. I wrote it down. The exact words. 16 months, and I know, Brennan said. The coalition offer doesn't address the supply chain disruption. The access agreement assumes material flow through the inner reach only. It solves our sort of transit corridor problem. It doesn't solve our people problem." "I know," Brennan said again. "Then the offer needs to be different," Brennan said. "Yeah, I've been trying, I think, to get that into the framework for 2 weeks, and I've got one more shot at it this afternoon." He looked at Vaughn. "But I need you to say it in the room. Not through draft. Not in subtext. You say it, the settlements, the 16 months, what you actually need, and I can argue for a restructured agreement that addresses both problems." Vaughn was still. "You're asking me to show weakness," he said. "I'm asking you to show the actual problem," Brennan said. "There's a for what it's worth difference." He paused. "Everyone in that room knows the settlements are struggling. In my opinion, data is in the coalition economic models. Saying it out loud doesn't create weakness, which not saying it means we spend the next 6 weeks negotiating the wrong deal." A very long quiet. Ferreira had stopped writing. She was looking at her table surface. I think she was listening. "You trust these people," Vaughn said. It wasn't quite a question. "I trust the process," Brennan said. "And I trust that Vethran wants this to work more than she wants to be right about how it works." He looked at the table again. "I don't trust everyone in the room. I trust enough of them." Vaughn was quiet for a long moment. "In the Reach," he said slowly, "we've a word, Sothvale. It means the one who stands between what you're and what you've to become. The bridge bearer." He looked at Brennan. "It isn't a comfortable thing to be called." Brennan didn't answer immediately. Honestly, his jaw shifted. "No," he said. "I imagine not." Drav reappeared at the chamber entrance, looking for Vaughn. He saw the two of them and went very still in the doorway. "Well," Vaughn stood, straightened his formal jacket, a small, precise gesture. "This to be fair, afternoon," he said to Brennan. "This afternoon," Brennan said. Vaughn walked toward the door. Plus, past Drav, who held very carefully still, and out into the corridor. Drav stood in the doorway for one more moment, looking at Brennan with an expression I couldn't file cleanly. Not hostility, not respect, something between them that didn't have a common translation. Then he left. I sat in, I guess, my monitoring alcove and wrote entry 7231 for a long time. When I was done, I'd filled more log space than I'd in any single entry in 40 cycles of intelligence work. I summarized it at the bottom with one line. He didn't use what he knew. That's the whole story. Everything else is detail. Log entry 7238. Afternoon session. I'm writing this in real time, and I'm aware that real-time field notes are methodologically inadvisable because they lack reflective distance, and frequently collapse into either dry transcription or the journalistic equivalent of shouting. I'm going to do my best. 0900 this morning feels like it happened in a different week. The afternoon session opened at 13:30. The chamber felt different. Smaller. Somehow, though the dimensions hadn't changed. The neutral spectrum lighting was the same. The seats were the same. But Vaughn's delegation arranged themselves differently. Drav one position back from where he'd been in the morning, the communications officer quieter, the medical aide closer to Vaughn's left side instead of the periphery. And Vaughn himself sat differently. Not more relaxed, that's not the word. More present. Like something in him that had been operating at an angle to the room had turned to face it directly. Brennan was in his technical observer chair. Same position, and for what it's worth, same posture. He had no notes in front of him. Veth ran opened the afternoon session with the standard procedural acknowledgement, the formal resumption language, the confirming of the morning's agreements. She's a voice that belongs in rooms like this. Measured, carrying, the kind that makes everything it says sound considered even when it's administrative. She moved to the access framework preliminary parameters. Item 4. Where the morning had stalled. Drav leaned forward, and Vaughn said, "May I?" It stopped the room. Not loudly. He said it quietly, with a brief gesture toward Drav. I've observed Seed, and Drav settled back with an expression that I couldn't decode but filed as not surprised, not pleased, committed. Vethran basically said, "Of course, Warlord." Vaughn looked at the table for a moment. Then at Vethran. Then, briefly, actually precisely at Brennan. Pretty much, Brennan didn't react. His hands were flat on the table. My outer settlements, Vaughn said, have 16 months of sustainable operation at current resource levels. The room adjusted. That micro shift of attention that happens when something real enters a formal space. Every species does it differently. It happens the same way, a collective recalibration, a settling toward. The access framework as proposed addresses the transit corridor problem, Vaughn continued. It doesn't address the supply chain disruption that's the primary threat to habitation continuity in 7 of my outer systems. He said it plainly. No embellishment and no defensive framing. The way you say a problem out loud when you've made the decision to stop carrying it alone. If we sign the current agreement, the coalition gains transit access. My outer settlements lose their people in 16 months. That isn't a partnership. That is a purchase. The silence held. Admiral Vethran's third and fourth limbs adjusted. She was processing. I watch her process. Ferreira had gone very still. This information, Vethran said carefully, was not included in the preliminary exchange documentation. No, Vaughn said. It was not. May I ask why? Vaughn's eyes moved, just briefly, to the end of the coalition table. Because, he said, I was waiting to know whether it would be used or heard. Vethran followed his gaze. She looked at Brennan for a moment, and I want to note this carefully because it matters. Vethran is one of the most experienced diplomatic operators in the coalition. She's run 37 major negotiations, and when she looked at Brennan in that moment, what crossed her face was not confusion or offense. It was something I can only describe as recalibration. Like a navigator who has been working from a chart that was slightly wrong and has just gotten a correction. She turned back to Vaughn, which then, it will be heard, she said. What happened next was not a negotiation in the traditional sense. Negotiations have structure, opening positions, counteroffers, concession architecture, the careful dance of revealing and concealing preference. What happened in the afternoon session was closer to, I struggled to find a term in my language, and then I found it in Vaughn's Duthkale, roughly translated. The moment when everyone in the room stops performing the conversation they were having and starts having the actual one. Vaughn laid out the settlement situation without hedging. The supply chain disruption had roots in a cooperative trade restriction from 6 cycles back. A retaliatory move in a dispute that had technically been resolved but whose infrastructure damage had never been repaired. 3 primary supply routes into the outer reach were operating at 40% capacity. 2 more had actually been rerouted through inner systems and were experiencing transfer delays that compounded over months into a meaningful deficit. The settlements weren't starving. Not yet, but they were in the particular kind of slow decline that's worse than crisis because crisis mobilizes response and slow decline just continues. Plus, Ferreira asked technical questions. Precise, rapid, the kind that cut through the surface of a problem to its load-bearing structure. I revised my assessment of her from brilliant or asleep to brilliant, full stop. Vethran listened. Her 4 middle limbs made small adjustments throughout, a biological processing signal I'd learned to read as serious engagement. Drav remained very quiet. I noted that too. Brennan said nothing for the first 40 minutes of this exchange. He sat in his technical observer chair with his hands flat on the table and tracked the conversation with that particular quality of attention. Not absent, not performing patience. Listening the way people listen when the information matters more than their response to it. At the 42-minute mark, Thran said, "The existing access framework can be amended. The supply chain issue is not simple, but addressable. There are 2 coalition logistics programs currently under work in the peripheral reaches that could be restructured. The Keth cooperative restriction," Ferreira said, "can be challenged through the trade arbitration framework. We have standing. It would take 8 cycles to fully resolve, but we can issue a provisional neutralization order within 3 months that would restore partial supply flow." "Partial," Vaughn said. "To start," Ferreira said. "Then full." There was a pause. "Plus," Brennan said, "the medical contractor in the second-tier settlements." The room turned toward him. The first time he'd spoken in the afternoon session. His voice was the same as always, flat, informational, without extra weight. "They're the distribution network," he said, "and they're already operating in the settlement clusters. If the supply restoration goes through a new infrastructure channel, it'll take months to set up and another few months to trust. The contractor is already trusted. Restructure the material support through their existing logistics rather than a new coalition program." Ferreira looked at him. "That would require sort of the contractor to take on distribution functions outside their license scope." "Yeah," Brennan said. "The licensing amendment takes about 2 weeks." He said this like it was obvious. Like he'd checked. Like somewhere between day 1 and this afternoon he'd mapped the entire distribution infrastructure of the outer reach settlements and found the existing node that could carry the solution. Maybe he had. I believe by this point that he probably had. Thran looked at him for a moment, which then at Vaughn. Vaughn was looking at Brennan with an expression I'd been trying to classify for 3 days. It wasn't gratitude. That's too simple, which it wasn't the look of a leader seeing an ally. It was something older and more specific, the expression of a person recognizing a pattern they thought only their own people made. He reached into the inner pocket of his formal jacket. He put something on the table, which is single boot. Well-worn. Coalition manufacture, standard military tread pattern. Small, junior officer, probably, or a crew member not large in build. I stared at it, which every person at both tables stared at it. "Third delegation," Vaughn said. "Navigator's second officer." She cried when they took her shoes. He looked at the boot. To be fair, not from fear. She'd been on her feet for 60 hours when they boarded. She was just tired. He was quiet for a moment. "I kept it, I guess, because I told her I'd bring it back when there was something worth coming back to." The chamber was very still. "If we reach an agreement today," he said, "I'd like to return it. I wrote this in the log. I wrote every word exactly as it was said. Then I wrote, this is the actual summit. Everything for what it's worth. Before this was the approach." They reached an agreement, which it took 4 more hours. For hours of technical work, legal architecture, the careful, specific language of binding diplomatic instruments that mean exactly what they say and nothing more and nothing less. Ferreira was brilliant. Thran was precise. Drav contributed, eventually, not as an obstacle, but as someone who knew the inner reach's administrative structure better than anyone else in the room and whose expertise, once the posturing stopped, was genuinely useful. I documented all of it. Every clause, every concession, every amendment, the final language of the access agreement, and the supply restoration framework, and the medical contractor licensing amendment, and the provisional neutralization order for the cooperative restriction. I also documented the moment at hour 2 of the technical session when Drav leaned toward Vaughn, said something low in Varek, and Vaughn responded with a single word I caught clearly. Sothvale. The bridge bearer. Drav sat back. He looked at Brennan, who was going over the draft supply chain language with Ferreira and hadn't heard this exchange, and he had the expression of a man updating something he believed for a long time. I noted this. I noted everything, which the signing happened at 1847. Standard format. Both principals sign, delegates witness, formal record confirmed by the session documentation officer. Thran signed for the coalition, which Vaughn signed for the reach. The documents were witnessed by Ferreira, Drav, the medical aide, 2 senior aides. Me, pulled from my monitoring alcove at Vethran's request because she needed another witness, and the junior staff were otherwise occupied. I stood at the chamber floor, 1 step behind Vethran, and watched Vaughn sign his name to something that had taken 4 delegations, and for rejections, and 16 months of countdown to reach. His handwriting was small. I don't know why I noticed that. I noticed it. After the signing, there was a brief, formal exchange of the documents, the standard confirmation language, the procedural closure. Everyone was very correct about it. Then, the formality broke slightly. Not in a celebration. Nothing so undignified as celebration. But into the quiet warmth of a room where something genuinely difficult has been accomplished. Vaughn went to Ferreira and said something about the Keth arbitration timeline that made her nod and take out her tablet. Drav spoke to 2 of the coalition aides about administrative coordination for the logistics restructuring. The chamber shifted from formal to working, from distance to proximity, from performance to practice. Vaughn crossed to the coalition table's far end, to Brennan. He stopped in TBH, front of him, and stood with the particular upright stillness of a Varek in formal mode. But the formality was different from the morning session's formality. Morning was posture. Look, this was respect. I need to ask you something, Vaughn said. Brennan waited. The Keth settlement. 4 cycles ago, you spent 41 days in my territory unauthorized, mapping a solution to a dispute I told 3 previous delegations was unresolvable. He paused. Why? Brennan looked at him. Because the previous delegations were trying to resolve the dispute. A moment. And you weren't. I was trying to figure out why 2 sides that both wanted to stop fighting couldn't find a way to say so without it looking like surrender. Brennan picked up his tablet from the table. Put down again. Turned out they both needed the same exit route. They just needed someone to find it and stand in it first. Vaughn was quiet. You could have done that for profit, he said. Coalition avancement. Leverage. Yeah, Brennan said. But you didn't. Brennan looked at him steadily. Would you? I think very long pause. No, Vaughn said. Didn't he? He reached into his jacket again. He produced the same boot he'd placed on the table. Had pocketed it again after the signing. I realized some protocol of his own, and held it in both hands for a moment with a care that made it look heavier than it was. He TBH said, You understand what this means. The protection right. Brennan said, Yeah. It's a formal acknowledgement, Vaughn said. In Reach culture, it means the one who holds these travels with you. In responsibility. In commitment. He paused. Pretty much. It's not symbolic only. There are obligations. I know, Brennan said. Vaughn looked at him for a long moment. I have called you Safale, he said. My people would call you that now. They will call you that when the supply routes open and the settlements survive and the navigator gets her shoe back. He held out the boot. I'd call you something else, if you permit it. Brennan looked at the boot. He had a very specific stillness that I'd come to recognize as him making a decision about something that mattered. What? He said, which Kethdoval, Vaughn said. There's no trade standard translation that holds the full meaning. The closest is the one who walks into the fight carrying nothing that can be used against you. Brennan was quiet. My people use it for someone who hasn't thing to prove and doesn't pretend otherwise, Vaughn said. Someone who shows up with only what's true. He paused. I have met many of your kind in the last 8 cycles. I haven't met another one who earns this word. Brennan took the boot. He held it with the same specific care Vaughn had given it. Not like a diplomatic token, like an object that contained something that mattered. He said, She's going to want her other one too. Vaughn's expression changed. It was the first time in all my observation of him that I saw something that could be called humor. Not performed, not strategic, just a small, private shift in the set of his face that meant something had landed exactly right. I have it, he said. I have all of them. The navigator's name was Sela Owusu. Yes, Owusu. Same surname as the junior communications attaché who laughed too loud. They weren't related. The coincidence, honestly, felt like something the universe did just to check if I was paying attention. She was contacted via coalition channels the following morning, told that the Warlord of the Sorrowed, Reach, had her shoes and would like to return them, that she should present herself at the nearest coalition transit point for a personal delivery within a month. I pretty much was told she cried again. Not from fear. I filed my final report on the Vaughn Reach assignment at 0300, day 8. 41 pages. Context-rich. I copied Davrin and went to sleep before the response came in. When I woke up, there were 2 messages. Davrin said, "Good work, and get some rest. We have 3 more assignments flagged in the next cycle." The other was from Brennan. It said, "Thanks for the note about the partition documents." Well, that was it. Nothing else. No diplomatic language. No formal acknowledgement. No professional courtesy framing. I sat with it for a moment. Then I wrote back, for question marks? He responded in 11 minutes. Yeah. I don't know what that exchange means in any formal sense. I TBH know what it means in the sense that things mean things between people who've been. In the same, in my opinion, maintenance corridor at 0615 on the worst morning of a summit that matters. The settlements have 16 months. 16 months from the date of the summit. Less now, I guess. Days 7 and 8 are gone, and the arbitration clock has already started, and the licensing amendment was filed the morning after signing with the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that suggests Ferreira had the paperwork ready before the session even ended. The supply routes will open. The settlements will survive. The navigator will get her shoes, and I have one more thing to record, and then I'm closing this log. On the transport back to the analysis station, I had a 7-hour transit. Standard mid-class vessel, adequate but not comfortable, the kind of ship where the recyclers run, slightly cold, and the commissary stocks 3 things and 2 of them are the same. I sat in a window seat and watched the Reach shrink in the port viewer, the bluish light from that direction getting smaller, just dark and stars indistinguishable from everywhere else. I thought about what Vaughn had said. Kethdoval, the one who walks into the fight carrying nothing that can be used against you. I thought about the room full of people laughing at the small Terran, and the small Terran waiting for them to finish. I thought about 41 days unauthorized in Vaughn's territory 8 cycles ago, with a signals officer turned warlord who couldn't sleep and was protecting something, and one human who figured out what it was and chose not to use it. I thought about the shoe on the table. I pulled up Brennan's file. The full file, full access. I looked at it for a while, and the redactions. The incomplete record. The outline of a person in all the space that wasn't there. His first name. It was in the file. I just stopped looking after the profile felt dismissive. It was Kian. Irish, probably, or, well, one of the diaspora variants. I checked the cultural database. Pronounced Kian, which means ancient or enduring. I don't believe in meaningful coincidences. I work in intelligence. Meaningful coincidences are usually someone's plan. But I closed the file and looked out the port viewer at the shrinking Reach, and I thought, enduring. Yeah, that fits. I reached the analysis station 43 hours after filing my final report. Davrin met me at the dock, which he never does. He looked kind of at me for a moment and said, "You actually liked him." I said, "He gets results." Davrin said, "That's not what I said." I walked past him toward the station entrance. He called after me. Next assignment's a first contact. New species, rim territories, uncharted system. Coalition's sending a specialist team. I stopped. Plus, which specialist? I said. Davrin's expression was something I couldn't read, and I've spent 3 years learning to read him. They put in the request this morning, he said. Very specific. Asked by name. I turned around. When do we leave? I said.